The auctioneer moved through Lot 14 in under 4 minutes. A 3-story Victorian estate, 4 acres, vacant 40 years. Opening bid $47,000. Not one other hand went up. Eileen Harwood lowered her paddle and wrote the check. 72 years old, retired structural engineer, 38 years reading buildings the way a doctor reads a patient. Not the surface, not the cosmetic damage, but the bones underneath. She had walked this property before the auction. She knew what the others had missed. The foundation was sound. The primary walls were 18-inch brick. The structure was intact beneath 40 years of ivy and silence. She bought the building because she could read it. What she could not read not yet was the south wall of the basement. On the first morning of the structural assessment, her contractor, Marcus Webb, ran his hand along the brick and stopped. He knocked with his knuckles. The sound came back wrong. He turned to her and said 4 words. "The mortar is not original." Eileen raised her flashlight. Different color, different texture, different era. Someone had built this wall after the house was finished, after the foundation was poured, after the building was occupied and lived in and eventually abandoned. Someone had sealed something inside this estate. And in 38 years of reading structures, Eileen Harwood had never once walked away from a wall that did not add up. The sealed room at Halstead. Walter Finch arrived at 9 in the morning with a folder thick enough to suggest 40 years of administrative patience. He was 75 years old and had been the executor of the Halstead estate since 1984, when the last occupant died without heirs, and the county had taken possession and handed the matter to the nearest available person with legal standing. That person had been Walter, who had been working at the county trust office at the time, and had accepted the assignment with the understanding that it would be resolved quickly. 40 years later, he was handing the keys to a retired structural engineer from Columbus who had been the only bidder at the auction. He gave Eileen 2 keys on a ring and the folder and a brief history of the property's legal status since 1984, which amounted to nothing had changed. No one had been interested, the taxes had been paid from a small perpetual maintenance fund established in the original estate documents, and the building had sat. 40 years nobody bought it, he said. He looked at the facade, the ivy, the boarded windows, the cast iron fence along the road frontage still standing straight despite everything. Maybe it was waiting for you. Eileen thanked him and he drove away, and she stood in the drive with Marcus Webb and looked at Halstead Estate in the October morning light. Marcus was 58 years old and had been assessing and demolishing structures in central Ohio for 35 years. He was not a man who said more than the situation required. He had looked at the exterior on the drive-in and had said the roofline was holding and the chimney on the east elevation needed pointing, and the foundation drainage on the north side had to be addressed before winter. 3 observations, each one accurate, each one delivered without preamble. They went inside. The ground floor, first the entry hall with its plaster medallions cracked, but present the parlor and the library and the dining room in various states of cosmetic failure, the wallpaper peeling in long strips, the floors dusty but sound underfoot. Eileen walked each room with her measuring tape and her notepad, checking spans and load points and the condition of the primary walls, while Marcus moved independently, pressing palms against surfaces, testing joinery, crouching to examine the base of the walls where structural problems usually announce themselves first. The upper floor's 2 bedrooms with their original hardware intact, a servant's stair that had been sealed at some point and would need to be reassessed, a bathroom addition from the early 20th century that had introduced some water damage to the northeast corner of the second floor. Manageable. Everything Eileen had assessed from the outside was confirmed from the inside. The building was what she had believed it to be when she raised her paddle, a sound structure, wearing a century and a half of neglect, like a coat that needed cleaning rather than replacing. They descended to the basement. The access was through a door off the kitchen, the original basement stairs steep and narrow, the treads worn smooth at the center from decades of use and preserved by decades of disuse. Eileen went first with her flashlight, Marcus behind her with his own light and the particular alertness of someone who had learned that basements in old structures held surprises. The basement was long and low, the ceiling perhaps 7 feet at the center and diminishing toward the foundation walls. The floor was packed earth, the kind that had compacted over a century and a half, to something approaching the hardness of stone. The foundation walls were dressed stone, the same blue-gray limestone she had examined on the exterior, the courses laid in the 1870s by people who understood that a foundation was not the place to economize. She walked the perimeter with her flashlight. West wall, original stone, the mortar consistent throughout a section of old shelving, still bolted to the surface at the north end. North wall, the same construction, a coal chute opening that had been sealed with brick at some point. East wall stone foundation, a small window well near the ceiling that admitted a thin strip of October light. She turned to the south wall. Marcus was already there. He was running his hand along the brick surface in the slow, methodical way of someone who was reading a material rather than touching it. Eileen watched him stop, watched his hand move back 6 inches and press flat against the wall, watched him knock with his knuckles once, twice, a third time, moving laterally along the surface. He turned to look at her. "Mrs. Harwood." No drama in his voice, just the flat delivery of a man reporting a finding. "This mortar is not the same age as the foundation." Eileen crossed the basement and stood beside him. She raised her flashlight and looked at the wall directly. 38 years of reading structural surveys had calibrated her eye for what mortar communicated. Its color spoke to its composition, its texture to its age. The way it had settled into the joints over time told you when it had been applied and under what conditions. The stone foundation walls around her were mortared with lime putty of the 1870s, the pale gray of a material that had been curing for a century and a half, the surface slightly chalky, the joints compressed and true. The south wall was different. The brick itself was period-appropriate, similar manufacture, similar color, the kind of common brick available throughout Ohio in the latter decades of the 19th century. But the mortar was warmer in tone, slightly more orange in the lime mix, the texture at the surface less chalky and more dense. The joints were more regular than the foundation work, the application more controlled. This was not the mortar of the 1870s. She reached into the folder Walter had given her and pulled out the building plans, the original architectural drawings, filed with the county when Halstead Estate was constructed, dated 1872, the only official record of the building's designed configuration. She found the basement plan and spread it on a wooden crate near the stairs. She looked at the south wall. She looked at the basement plan. She looked at the south wall again. The basement plan showed the south foundation wall as original dressed stone, consistent with the other 3 walls. There was no partition wall indicated at any point along the south end of the basement, no storage division, no secondary structure of any kind. The basement, according to the only official drawing that existed for this building, was a single open space. The brick wall in front of her was not in the drawings. It was not a mistake. She had been reading architectural drawings for 38 years, and she understood the difference between an omission and an absence. This wall was not missing from the drawings because a draftsman had forgotten it. It was missing because it had not existed when the drawings were made. Someone had built it later. She pressed her palm flat against the brick and pushed. Solid. Well built, the construction of someone who knew what they were doing. She knocked with her knuckles the same motion Marcus had used and listened to the sound that came back. Not the dense flat return of a wall backed by solid fill or another wall close behind it. Something else. A contained resonance. Air behind the surface space behind the brick, the particular acoustic quality of a sealed room returning its own held breath. She stood in front of the wall for a long moment. She was a structural engineer. She had bought this building to restore it, not to excavate its history. She had a budget and a timeline and a list of necessary repairs that did not include investigation of architectural anomalies that might turn out to be nothing more than a storage alcove someone had walled off and forgotten. But she was also a structural engineer, and structural engineers did not walk away from walls that were not in the drawings. She looked at Marcus. He was watching her with the patience of a man who had worked alongside enough engineers to know that they always reached the same conclusion eventually. "I can open a hole," he said. "Big enough to see inside. $200. You want me to do it?" Eileen looked at the wall, at the mortar that was not the same age as the foundation, at the basement plan that showed nothing where this wall stood, at the space that was clearly behind the brick, the space that had been sealed inside this building for longer than anyone currently living had been alive. "Go ahead," she said. Marcus picked up the hammer he had set on the floor when he came down the stairs. He positioned himself in front of the wall and looked back at her once. "Step back a little, Mrs. Harwood." She stepped back. The hammer connected with the brick, a single controlled strike, the impact precise, the force directed into the mortar joint rather than the brick face. The joint cracked. A second strike. A third. Marcus worked methodically, removing the first brick cleanly, then the second, then clearing the mortar around the opening, with the efficiency of someone who had done this kind of work thousands of times. Dust rose in the beam of the flashlight. The smell that came through the opening was cold and dry and very still, the particular quality of air that had been sealed against the outside world for a very long time. Marcus stepped back and looked at Eileen. She moved forward and raised her flashlight and directed the beam through the opening. Her first impression was darkness, the darkness of a space that had received no light since the last brick was mortared into place. Her second impression was scale larger than an alcove, larger than a storage void. A room. The beam moved across a floor, across walls, across a ceiling. And then the beam caught the surface of a table, a drafting table. Wood, the kind used for architectural work, the surface angled for drawing. On the table, instruments, rulers, compasses, the tools of a professional draftsman. On the wall behind the table, affixed with the particular care of someone who had placed them, deliberately rolled sheets of paper opened and displayed. Eileen raised the flashlight and steadied her hand and directed the beam at the nearest sheet, an architectural drawing. Ink on drafting paper, the precision of professional work, the kind of drawing she had spent 38 years reading. She could see the floor plan, the elevations, the structural notations in a careful technical hand. And in the lower right corner of the sheet where the title block appeared, on every architectural drawing she had ever examined 2 lines of text in that same precise hand. She narrowed the beam to read them. E. Vance, Architect, 1887. She stood at the opening in the brick wall with the flashlight in her hand and did not move for a long moment. Harlan Vance had died in 1901. The official record of Halstead Estate showed it designed by Harlan Vance in 1872. E. Vance, 1887. "Marcus," she said. Her voice was very quiet. "There is a room in here." If you believe that the right person always finds what has been waiting to be found, subscribe. There is more on the other side of this wall. The opening was wide enough to pass through after 30 minutes of careful work. Marcus had removed the bricks in sections, working from the first hole outward, the demolition controlled and systematic, not destruction, but surgery. Each brick extracted cleanly, the mortar joints chipped without damage to the surrounding courses. He stacked the removed bricks against the basement wall in the order they came out of habit Eileen had noticed on previous jobs, and had come to appreciate as evidence of a man who understood that how you took something apart told you how it had been put together. When the opening reached approximately 3 feet wide and 5 feet tall, he stepped back and looked at Eileen. She went in first. She had to duck slightly at the top of the opening, her flashlight held out in front of her, her other hand braced against the brick frame. She straightened on the other side and stood still, and let the beam move slowly around the room. 10 feet by 12, she estimated. The ceiling was low, perhaps 6.5 feet at the center, the underside of the basement floor joists visible overhead. No windows. In the far corner of the north wall near the ceiling line, a small opening 3 inches by 6, a ventilation passage cut through the foundation stone to the exterior. The air in the room was cold and dry, with the particular dryness of a sealed space that had maintained its own climate in complete isolation from the building above it and the seasons outside. The walls were plastered. Not rough foundation stone like the rest of the basement, finished plaster, the kind applied to interior living spaces, the surface painted in a pale cream that had held its color in the darkness for 135 years. Someone had finished this room with the same care they would have given a room meant to be inhabited. She moved the beam to the walls. 14 drawings, she counted, mounted on the plaster with small brass tacks, the corners secured against the possibility of rolling. Each one a full architectural drawing, the scale and format of professional work ink on drafting paper, the lines of a practiced and confident hand. She moved closer to the nearest drawing and held the flashlight steady. A floor plan. Halstead Estate. She could see the outline immediately, the distinctive footprint of the building above her, the room proportions she had walked that morning. The plan was more detailed than the 1872 survey drawings Walter had given her, more detailed and more technically specific, the structural notations present in a way they were not in the official county filing. This was not a presentation drawing. This was a working drawing, the kind made by an architect who was designing rather than displaying. She moved the beam to the lower right corner. E. Vance Architect, 1887. She moved along the wall, each drawing the same signature, the same year. Elevation sections, details of the molding profiles and the stair construction and the fireplace surrounds. The complete documentation of a building, not the simplified record submitted to a county office for permit approval, but the full technical record of a design worked out by someone who understood every element of what they were making. She turned to the center of the room. The drafting table was walnut. She could see the grain beneath the dust, the quality of the wood that told you it had been chosen rather than simply used. The surface was angled for drawing, the angle adjusted by a mechanism at the base that had held its position for 135 years. On the table surface, a set of rulers, their brass edges dark with tarnish, but the calibrations still precise. A compass, the points sharp, the adjustment wheel intact. A pen holder with 3 nibs, the metal oxidized. An inkwell, the glass clouded, the ink inside, dried to a dark residue at the bottom. And a journal. Brown leather, the cover worn at the corners in the way of a book that had been handled regularly before it was set down for the last time. A brass clasp, not locked. She reached out and opened the clasp and lifted the cover. The handwriting on the first page was ink the script of the late 19th century, the letters formed with the particular deliberateness of someone who had been taught to write with attention to legibility. Small, precise, slightly forward-leaning, the hand of a person accustomed to detailed work. Eleanor Vance, Private Journal, 1885. She read the first entry. Father says I have talent. Father says I draw better than any student he has trained. Father says the world will never allow a woman to sign her name to a building. Eileen stood in the sealed room with the flashlight and the open journal and read those 3 sentences. She was 72 years old. She had been one of 4 women in her graduating class of structural engineers in 1975. She had spent her first decade of professional life being handed coffee at meetings she had been hired to lead, being asked to explain her credentials to contractors half her age, being told in various forms that the industry would come around eventually. She had come around eventually. She looked at the drafting table and the 14 drawings on the walls and the journal in her hands, and understood what she was standing inside. Not a storage room, not a hidden chamber, a studio, a workspace that Eleanor Vance had created, had commissioned, had designed, had built in secret beneath the house she was designing in secret, in order to do work that the world had told her she was not permitted to do under her own name. She sat down on the step at the opening of the room, the flashlight balanced on her knee, the journal open in her hands, and read. The entries from 1885 and 1886 documented the early stages of a design commission the Halstead family had approached Harlan Vance's firm in the spring of 1885, and Eleanor had begun preliminary sketches while her father handled the client meetings. She wrote about the site, about the light at different hours, about the way the approach from the county road should meet the front elevation. She wrote about structural problems and how she had solved them. She wrote with the focus of a person who was entirely engaged with the work, not the struggle of it, not the injustice of it, but the work itself. Marcus appeared in the opening. "Everything all right in there?" Eileen looked up. She had not been aware of the time passing. "Come in," she said. "Watch the step." He ducked through and straightened and looked around the room with the expression of a man who had opened a lot of walls in his career and had not expected this particular room to be behind one of them. He looked at the drawings. He looked at the drafting table. He looked at Eileen sitting on the step with the journal. He said nothing. She turned to the page she had found marked with a folded slip of paper, a placeholder she understood placed by Eleanor at some point when she expected to return to this entry, and had not. October 1887. Today, Father submitted the Halstead estate design to the County Building Committee, under his name. I stood in the parlor when he rolled my drawings and said, "Thank you for your help with this, Eleanor. But this is men's work." I did not cry. I went down to the basement and I drew. I do not know why I keep drawing. Perhaps because I do not know what else to do. Eileen sat on the step at the entrance to Eleanor Vance's studio and held the journal and looked at the 14 drawings on the walls, the 14 drawings that documented a building that had been standing for 135 years above the room where they had been made. She did not say anything for a long time. Marcus stood in the room and waited, and did not say anything either. Some things did not need commentary. Some rooms said everything that needed to be said simply by existing. If what you just heard stopped you for a moment, that is the room working the way Eleanor intended. Subscribe so you are here for what comes next. Eileen called Walter Finch at 10:30 that morning. She had come back up from the basement and walked through the ground floor of Halstead Estate, while Marcus continued the careful work of widening the opening, and she had stood in the parlor and looked up at the ceiling and then at the staircase and then at the entry hall, and she had called Walter and asked him to bring everything. He arrived at noon with a steel document box that he carried with both hands and set on the parlor floor with the careful deliberateness of a man who had been responsible for its contents for 4 decades. He had the slightly unsettled quality of someone who had received a phone call whose implications he had not yet fully resolved. He opened the box. The 1872 drawings were on top, 4 sheets, the official filing documents submitted to the Licking County Building Committee when Halstead Estate was permitted for construction. Eileen had seen copies of these in the county archive before the auction, but had not examined them closely because her interest at that stage had been structural condition rather than architectural history. She took the 1872 drawings and carried them to the center of the parlor and knelt down and spread them on the floor. Then she went back to the basement and brought up 3 of Eleanor's drawings from the studio, the floor plan, the front elevation, and the parlor section with the ceiling detail, and carried them upstairs and spread them on the floor beside the 1872 sheets. She straightened up and looked at the 2 sets of drawings side by side. Walter stood at the edge of the room. Marcus stood in the doorway from the entry hall. Neither of them spoke. Eileen looked at the drawings for a long moment, the way she looked at everything that required her full attention completely without rushing, letting the information accumulate before she began to speak. Then she crouched down and pointed. The first thing she showed them was the parlor ceiling. In the 1872 drawing signed by Harlan Vance, the parlor ceiling was a simple vaulted structure timber, framing the standard construction of the period adequate for the span and unremarkable in its execution, the kind of ceiling that Harlan Vance had designed in a dozen buildings across central Ohio in the 1870s, competent and conventional. In Eleanor's 1887 drawing, the same parlor ceiling was something entirely different. A steel-framed vault, the ribs radiating from a central point in a fan configuration, 12 load points distributed around the perimeter of the room, the structural logic of a 19th century engineer who had understood that steel allowed geometries that timber could not achieve. It was not a conventional ceiling for 1887. It was an advanced piece of structural thinking for any decade of the 19th century. Eileen stood up and looked at the ceiling above her. 12 steel ribs radiating from a central boss, the fan configuration identical to Eleanor's drawing. The plaster that finished the ceiling had been applied over the steel framework following the geometry of the ribs, the surface following the curves that Eleanor had specified in her section drawing with precise technical notations in her small, careful hand. She walked to the ribs and reached up and pressed her palm against the plaster between 2 of the steel members. Solid. The plaster had cracked in several places across a century and a half of seasonal movement, but the steel beneath it was as sound as the day it was installed. She came back to the drawings and crouched down again and pointed to the staircase plan. The 1872 drawing showed a straight stair, the conventional solution, the primary staircase running directly from the entry hall to the upper floor landing in a single straight flight with a half-landing turn. Harlan Vance had used this configuration in 7 of the buildings in his portfolio, the reliable choice of a designer who had found a solution that worked and applied it consistently. Eleanor's 1887 drawing showed a spiral staircase. Not a simple spiral, a compound spiral, the radius varying as it rose, the treads widening toward the outer edge and narrowing toward the center in a mathematical progression that Eileen recognized immediately as the work of someone who had calculated the geometry rather than approximated it. The landing at the second floor was positioned to receive the stair at exactly the angle that would provide maximum visibility from the upper hallway. It was an elegant piece of spatial thinking. Eileen stood up and looked at the staircase. The spiral, the varying radius, the landing positioned precisely where Eleanor's drawing specified. She walked to the entry hall without speaking and looked up. The skylight was in the ceiling above the stair, the stained glass panel, the colors dimmed with a century of grime, but the geometry still visible, the leading still holding the glass in its pattern. The 1872 drawing showed no skylight. Eleanor's 1887 drawing showed the skylight in precise detail. The dimensions noted the color sequence of the glass, specified in marginal annotations in Eleanor's hand. Eileen stood under the skylight and looked up through the grime-darkened glass at the gray Ohio sky above it, and thought about Eleanor Vance standing in this exact position in March of 1888, looking at the ceiling she had designed, and that her father had built from her drawings and had stood in front of a newspaper photographer and called the masterwork of his life. She went back to the parlor. Walter was still standing at the edge of the room, his arms crossed, the expression of a man who was watching his understanding of a 40-year custody rearrange itself. She stood over the 2 sets of drawings and looked at Walter. Halstead Estate was not built from the 1872 drawings, she said. Her voice was steady and quiet, the voice she had used in 38 years of delivering structural findings to people who did not always want to hear them. It was built from the 1887 drawings. The ceiling, the staircase, the skylight, every distinctive feature of this building exists in Eleanor's drawings and does not exist in Harlan's. The building that was permitted and contracted under Harlan Vance's name was built from his daughter's design. Walter looked at the drawings. He looked at the staircase visible through the parlor doorway. He looked at the ceiling above him. Harlan Vance was the most respected architect in the Midwest, he said. The voice of a man not yet ready to complete the thought he was in the middle of. "I know," Eileen said. "You're saying he took his daughter's design." Eileen looked at the 2 sets of drawings on the floor. The 1872 sheets, conventional, competent, the reliable work of an experienced professional, and Eleanor's 1887 sheets, the work of someone who had thought harder and further, and had found solutions that her father's version had not. "I don't know what word to use for what he did," she said. "He filed the wrong drawings and built from the right ones. The wrong ones had his name, the right ones had hers." She paused. "He built her building under his name. That's what the drawings say." Marcus had not moved from the doorway. He had been listening with the focused attention of someone who was following the argument without entirely following the technical evidence, and who had arrived at the conclusion through the accumulation of everything he had observed rather than through any single moment of understanding. Walter looked at the floor for a moment. Then he looked at the ceiling, at the 12 steel ribs of the fan vault that Eleanor Vance had specified in a drawing she had made in a room in the basement of this house, in a room that had been sealed behind a brick wall before most of the people currently living had been born. Eileen picked up Eleanor's journal from where she had set it on the parlor windowsill. She had marked the page before she came upstairs. She turned to it now and read, "March 1888. I saw the house today. It is more beautiful than I imagined it would be. The vault, my vault holds. Father built every detail exactly as I drew it. But when the reporter from the Columbus Dispatch came to photograph it, Father said this is the masterwork of my life. I stood at the back of the crowd. No one looked at me. I wondered if I died tomorrow, would anyone know I had existed? The parlor was very quiet. The afternoon light came through the tall windows, the windows that Eleanor had positioned in her drawings to catch the afternoon light at exactly this angle, and fell across the two sets of drawings on the floor, the right ones and the wrong ones side by side. If you can see what Eileen sees in those two sets of drawings, stay with us. The story is just beginning to surface. She brought a lamp down on the second morning. Not the flashlight she had used, the flashlight for the initial examination, for the practical work of understanding what the room held and what it meant structurally. But the second morning was different. The second morning she was going to read, and reading required a different quality of light. She found a battery lantern in the equipment Marcus had left in the basement and carried it through the opening and set it on the corner of the drafting table, and adjusted the angle until the light fell across the journal pages the way lamplight would have fallen in 1887. She opened to 1885. Eleanor had been 22 years old when she began keeping this journal. Not a diary in the social sense, not a record of events and visitors and the texture of ordinary days. A working journal. The entries were dated, but their content was professional observations about buildings. She had examined notes on structural problems. She had identified calculations worked out in the margins beside the prose. The journal of someone who thought in the language of construction and had found that language more natural than any other. Father says I have the steadiest hand of any draftsman he has trained. He does not know that I understand the mathematics behind the drawings. I taught myself from his reference books at night. I did not tell him because I was not certain how he would receive it. Eileen sat with this for a moment. She had been one of 4 women in her graduating class of structural engineers in 1975. She had learned in her first years of professional practice to introduce her credentials before she introduced herself in meetings, to establish the engineering basis for her presence before someone had the opportunity to assume she had arrived to take notes. She had learned this not from a mentor, but from repetition, from the specific accumulation of being underestimated in enough rooms that adaptation became necessary. Eleanor had learned the same lesson 100 years earlier and had adapted in the only direction available to her. She read through 1885 and into 1886. The Halstead Commission appeared in March of 1886. A prosperous Columbus merchant named Halstead had engaged Harlan Vance to design a summer estate in Granville, a substantial project, the kind that would be written about in the Columbus papers and seen by the clients who engaged architects for significant work. Eleanor wrote about accompanying her father to the site and walking the land and thinking about the approach from the road and the quality of the afternoon light on the south elevation. Her father had made preliminary sketches. She had read them. Father's preliminary sketch for the parlor ceiling uses conventional timber framing. It will serve adequately. However, I calculate that under maximum snow load conditions with the proposed span, the deflection will exceed acceptable limits within 15 years. I recalculated the structural requirements this evening. A steel fan vault would resolve the loading problem and would also be considerably more beautiful. I will draw a version and present it to Father as a suggestion rather than a correction. Eileen set the journal on the table and looked up at the ceiling of the room above where she was sitting. The fan vault, 12 load points, steel members meeting at a central boss. She had pressed her palm against the nearest structural member yesterday and felt the precision of the construction, the load path exactly as Eleanor had detailed it, the geometry exactly as Eleanor had drawn it. Eleanor had identified a structural failure in her father's design before a single brick was laid, had recalculated the loads, had solved the problem, and had presented the solution as a suggestion. She read through the 1886 entries, the design developing entry by entry, the staircase, the skylight, the proportions of the entrance hall. Eleanor worked through the problems with the thoroughness of an engineer who was not designing to impress a client, but to solve a building. The structural logic was present in every decision. The beauty was a consequence of the logic, not a decoration applied over it. She reached October 1887. Harlan had come to Eleanor's room. She had been working on the final set of drawings, the construction documents ready for the county filing, and had looked at the complete design for the first time. Father stood at my table for a long time without speaking. Then he said, "You drew all of this yourself," I said. "Yes, Father." He was quiet for another long moment. Then he said, "It is better than mine would have been." He said it very quietly, as if he did not want to hear himself say it. I have been thinking about the expression on his face since he left the room. It was not pride, the way a father looks at a daughter who has done something well. It was something else. I think he was afraid of me. I think that was the first time in my life my father was afraid of me. 2 weeks later, a single entry. Father submitted the Halstead design to the county committee this morning. Under his name, I knew this would happen. Eileen read the 5 words again. I knew this would happen! Not a cry of outrage, not a record of confrontation. The statement of a woman who had understood the terms of the situation before the situation resolved itself, who had seen clearly what her father would do when the decision point arrived, and who had continued the work anyway, and who had not been surprised when the prediction proved accurate. She read through 1888, 1889, 1890. Eleanor continued to draw. Not new commissions, she had no commissions, and the journal did not suggest she had sought any. She drew variations on Halstead, the vault higher, the windows wider, the staircase configured differently, the skylight extended. She was not designing a different building. She was refining the building she had already designed, in the only space where she was permitted to do so, working through iterations of a project that had been completed and credited and photographed and written about in the Columbus papers under her father's name. Convevi troncan fong nai duoi long jat con la kien truxu, tren mat jat con la congai qua harlan vansa. I draw because in this room underground I am an architect. Above ground I am Harlan Vance's daughter. Eileen sat at Eleanor's drafting table with the battery lantern and the open journal and looked at the drawings on the walls, the 14 drawings that documented a building that was standing above her, and understood what the room was. Not a hiding place, not a secret kept from discovery. A studio that Eleanor had maintained because it was the only place where the true account of her work existed, the only place where the drawings were signed with her name, the only place where the building above her was correctly attributed. She had drawn here because drawing here was the one form of existing that had not been taken from her. She turned to the final pages. June 1891. Today I am locking this room and asking Thomas the groundskeeper to build the brick wall across the entrance. He did not ask why. I thanked him. I do not know who will open this wall. Perhaps no one. Perhaps in 100 years. If you are reading this, I am Eleanor Vance. I designed Halstead Estate in 1887 when I was 27 years old. My father signed his name to my drawings. I am not angry at him. I only want someone to know. Eileen read it twice. She looked up from the journal at the drawings on the walls. 14 drawings, the complete documentation of a building, each one signed E. Vance, Architect. 1887. Eleanor had not written the final entry in anger. She had written it in the same tone as everything else in the journal, the precise, careful, controlled voice of someone who had decided what they wanted to record and had recorded it accurately. She had not asked for justice or restitution or the public correction of a false record. She had asked for the simplest possible thing. She only wanted someone to know. She had waited 135 years. Eileen closed the journal carefully and set it on the drafting table beside the lantern. She looked at the room around her, the plastered walls, the brass instruments on the table, the drawings above her in the warm light. The room Eleanor had built for herself, in the only space available to her, the underground studio where she had been an architect for 6 years, before she locked the door and asked a groundskeeper to seal it. She sat with the weight of it for a long moment. Then she picked up the journal and stood and walked to the opening in the brick wall. Marcus was in the basement checking the foundation drainage on the north wall. He looked up when she came through. She said, "Marcus, I need your help with one more thing." He waited. "I need to find the Vance family, if anyone is still living." Eileen voa fatien ra Eleanor Vance ja chomotram, ba moilam namje, I jo biet tenba. Niu ban muon, te han trin jua, ten Eleanor tro lailich su, subscribe ngai boikio. She spent 3 days on the genealogical search. Walter Finch was the unexpected resource. 40 years of estate administration had given him a working knowledge of county records that went well beyond the specific files he had maintained for Halstead, and he sat with Eileen at the county records office on the second morning and pulled the relevant birth, death, and marriage records with the efficient familiarity of someone who had done this kind of research professionally and had not lost the habit. Harlan Vance had died in 1901. His son George had inherited the family architectural practice and had run it until his own death in 1935. George's son Harold had not gone into architecture. The county records showed him as a hardware merchant in Columbus through the middle decades of the 20th century, and Harold's son Richard had died in 2003, the last male Vance in the direct line. No children recorded. The male line of the Vance family was exhausted. Walter pulled the marriage records for Eleanor's generation and worked outward from there. Eleanor herself had never married, the records confirmed what the journal had suggested, a woman who had lived in Columbus until her death in 1942 without any family formation of her own. But Eleanor's younger sister Margaret had married a man named Bellamy in 1893 and had had 3 children, and the family had continued through the female line. The last living descendant carrying the Vance connection was a woman named Frances Vance Bellamy, 64 years old, living in Dayton. Eileen found the telephone number through the county directory and called on a Thursday afternoon from the parlor of Halstead Estate, standing among Eleanor's drawings spread across the floor. 4 rings. A woman's voice careful in the way of someone who had learned to be cautious about unknown callers. Eileen introduced herself without preamble. She was at Halstead Estate in Granville. She had purchased the property at auction. In the process of the structural assessment, she had found materials related to Eleanor Vance that she believed Frances should know about. Silence on the other end of the line. Then Frances said, "Aunt Eleanor." The particular quality in her voice was not surprise exactly. It was the quality of a name that had been part of the background of a life heard regularly and never examined closely, suddenly becoming the subject of direct attention. "She passed in 1942, Frances said. "Before I was born, but my mother talked about her often. She was the unusual one in the family, never married, always drawing. Mother said she had real talent, but nobody knew what she had done with it." A pause. "What did you find?" Eileen said, "Do you know what Halstead Estate is?" "The abandoned mansion in Granville. I read something about it years ago. It had been sealed for decades." Another pause. "What does Aunt Eleanor have to do with it?" Eileen said she designed it. Not her father, not Harlan. Eleanor designed it in 1887 when she was 27 years old. The line was quiet. Not the brief quiet of someone collecting a thought. A longer quiet, the silence of someone receiving information that was reorganizing something. Eileen waited. Frances said, "Do you have proof of that?" Eileen looked at the drawings spread across the parlor floor. The 14 drawings from Eleanor's studio, each one signed in the lower right corner in Eleanor's precise hand. The journal on the table, the fan vault above her, the spiral stair in the hall, the colored glass of Eleanor's skylight sending its amber and green light across the floorboards. She said, "I have 14 architectural drawings, signed E. Vance Architect, 1887. I have a journal Eleanor kept from 1885 to 1891 in which she documents the full design process for this building. And I have the building itself, the fan vault in the parlor ceiling, the spiral staircase, the skylight in the entry hall, all of which appear only in Eleanor's drawings and not in the 1872 filing your great-grandfather submitted to the county." She paused. "The building was constructed from Eleanor's drawings. I can demonstrate that, technically, from the structural details alone." Frances was quiet for a moment longer. When she spoke again, her voice had changed, still controlled, but carrying something underneath it that had not been there at the beginning of the call. She said, "I have a wooden box in my attic. My mother gave it to me 30 years ago when she moved out of the family house. She said it was letters from Aunt Eleanor to my grandmother Margaret going back to the 1880s. A pause. "I never read them all the way through. I looked at the first few when Mother gave them to me, and then I put the box back in the attic and left it there. I don't know why I never went back to it." Eileen looked at the journal on the table. "Eleanor's last entry, I only want someone to know." She said, "Those letters may tell us more than the drawings can." Frances was quiet for another moment. Then she said, "Mrs. Harwood, I have never been to Halstead Estate. I grew up hearing the Vance name as a family history, not a living thing. But if what you are telling me is true—" She stopped, started again. "I want to see Eleanor's room. I want to see the drawings. I want to understand who she actually was." She paused. "And I will bring the box." Frances arrived on a Saturday morning. She drove from Dayton alone, a 2-hour drive that Eileen had offered to shorten by meeting her somewhere closer, an offer Frances had declined. She wanted to arrive at Halstead Estate in the same way anyone who came to see a building should arrive from the road at the natural approach, seeing the facade as it presented itself. Eileen watched from the front steps as Frances's car came up the lane and stopped in the gravel drive. Frances Vance Bellamy was 64 years old and had the particular quality of someone who had been thinking carefully during a long drive and had arrived at a considered state. She got out of the car and stood in the drive and looked at the building the way Eileen had looked at it on her first morning. Not the quick assessment of someone checking off details, but the sustained attention of someone trying to receive the full impression before they moved closer. She was carrying a wooden box under her arm. Cherry wood, small, perhaps 14 inches by 10, the brass hardware darkened with age, the surface of the wood worn smooth in the way of an object that had been handled across many years and then set aside and handled occasionally thereafter, the wear of intermittent contact rather than daily use. She walked to the front steps and looked at Eileen. "The fan vault," she said. "You can see it through the parlor window from here." "Yes." Frances looked at the window for a moment. Then she looked at Eileen. "Show me her room first." They went through the house and down to the basement and through the opening Marcus had cut in the brick wall. Eileen had kept the battery lantern in Eleanor's studio since the second morning had charged it each evening and brought it back down each morning, a routine that had become natural without her deciding to make it one. Frances stepped through the opening and stood in the center of the room. She did not speak for a long time. She looked at the drawings on the walls, all 14, the complete documentation of a building, each one signed in the lower right corner with the same precise signature. She looked at the drafting table and the brass instruments and the dried inkwell. She looked at the ventilation passage in the north wall, the small opening Eleanor had ensured would keep the air from becoming entirely stagnant, the planning of a woman who intended to work in this room for years. She said finally, "She built this for herself." "Yes, underground, so she could work without anyone knowing." The journal explains it. She needed a space where she was an architect. This was the only space available to her. Frances looked at the nearest drawing. The structural section of the fan vault, the load paths annotated in Eleanor's hand, the geometry worked out with the confidence of someone who had calculated and recalculated until she was certain. She looked at it for a long time. Then she held out the wooden box. They carried it upstairs to the parlor where the light was better and there was space to spread the contents. Eileen had cleared a section of the floor the day before the same space where she had laid the 2 drawing sets for Walter's comparison. Frances set the box on the floor and sat down beside it, and Eileen sat across from her, and between them, above them, Eleanor's fan vault caught the afternoon light. Frances opened the box. The brass latch released cleanly. The hinges made a small sound. Inside, 31 letters tied in a bundle with a length of blue silk ribbon that had faded to the pale gray blue of aged silk, the bow still holding after 30 years in an attic. Frances untied the ribbon carefully and spread the letters on the floor in the order they had been bundled chronological, the earliest on top. They read in sequence, passing each letter between them after the first reading the way 2 people read documents together when both need to understand the full content. The March 1887 letter first. Eleanor's handwriting, the same precise hand as the journal, slightly more relaxed in correspondence, the letters of someone writing to a sister rather than keeping a professional record. "Dear Margaret, I have finished the drawings. They are the best work I have ever done, but Father will submit them under his name. I have agreed to this. Please do not tell anyone." Frances read it once and handed it across without speaking. The May 1887 letter. You ask why I allow Father to do this? Margaret Father is 59 years old. This may be the last major commission of his career. If I speak, he loses everything. I cannot do that to him, but I also cannot stop drawing. Frances pressed her lips together and passed it across. They worked through the sequence. The letters of 1888 Eleanor attending the dedication of Halstead Estate, standing near the kitchen entrance while Harlan received the congratulations of guests, a woman beside her, saying Harlan Vance is a true genius. Eleanor smiling and saying, yes, my father is very talented, and the woman never knowing. The letters of the 1890s, shorter and less frequent, Eleanor continuing to draw in her underground studio, while the world above her attributed her building to her father. The letters that documented a life lived in the gap between what she had made and what she was permitted to claim. Frances picked up the last letter. February 1901, 3 weeks before Harlan died. Eleanor's handwriting was unchanged across 16 years, the same precise script, the same slight forward lean, the hand of someone who had written carefully and consistently her entire life. Dear Margaret, Father is dying. The doctor says a matter of weeks. Yesterday he took my hand and said, Eleanor, I am sorry. I asked him, for what? Rather, he was quiet for a moment, and then he said, for everything. I did not ask him to say more. I held his hand and sat with him until he slept. I do not know what forgiveness means anymore, but I know I still love him. Frances read it to the end. She held it in her hands for a long time after she finished. Eileen looked at the letter from across the small distance of the cleared floor at Eleanor's handwriting in the February 1901 light that had somehow survived in the ink across 123 years at the last thing Eleanor had committed to paper about the central event of her professional life. For everything. The two words that contained everything Harlan could not say directly. The building, the drawings, the 14 years of credit taken, the talent recognized and taken in the same motion, the daughter who had understood and had chosen not to speak, and had loved him anyway, and had sat with him until he slept. Frances set the letter down on the floor. She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, not a dramatic gesture, just a practical response to something that had arrived before she had fully prepared for it. She said, 64 years I have lived and not known this. My mother, her mother, the whole family, 3 generations who knew Eleanor only as the unusual aunt who never married and spent her life drawing and died alone in Columbus in 1942. She looked at the fan vault above her. None of us knew she had built this. Eileen looked at the vault, the 12 load points, the steel members meeting at the central boss, the geometry that Eleanor had calculated on a night in 1886 when she had identified the flaw in her father's structural approach and had sat down and worked out the correct solution. It had been holding up the ceiling for 135 years. Frances gathered the letters carefully and tied them back with the blue ribbons slowly, with the deliberateness of someone handling something that had just become different in her hands from what it had been when she drove down from Dayton that morning. She placed them back in the cherrywood box. She looked at Eileen. She said, "We need to take these to the right person." Eileen said, "I know someone." Frances said, "Who?" Eileen said, "Dr. Lydia Chen, Ohio State University. She is an architectural historian. Her specialty is Gilded Age construction in the Midwest. If anyone can authenticate Eleanor's drawings and get them into the official record, it is her." Eleanor wrote 31 letters to her sister, and not one was read by anyone but Margaret until today. If you were Frances and had just learned the truth about your aunt after 64 years, what would you say to Eleanor? Leave your comment below. Dr. Lydia Chen arrived on a Tuesday morning with 2 graduate students and enough equipment to conduct a full forensic architectural analysis. She was 45 years old and had the focused energy of someone who had spent 2 decades moving efficiently between intellectual enthusiasm and professional discipline. She had published 3 books on Gilded Age architecture in the Midwest. She had examined hundreds of 19th century architectural drawings in archives and attics and county records offices across 5 states. She had told Eileen on the phone when Eileen first called that she had never received quite this kind of call before. She had agreed to come the same week. Her students set up equipment in the parlor while Lydia walked the building with Eileen. Not a social walk, a technical one. Lydia moving through each room with the systematic attention of someone conducting an examination, her eyes going to the structural details, the junctions, the places where the design decisions were most visible in the actual construction. She stood under the fan vault in the parlor for a long time without speaking. She reached up and pressed her palm against the nearest structural member, the same gesture Eileen had made on the first morning. Then she walked to the staircase and looked at the spiral geometry. Then to the entry hall and stood beneath the colored glass skylight and looked up at the amber and green light coming through Eleanor's panels. She did not speak until they were back in the parlor with the 14 drawings spread across the floor. She crouched at the structural section drawing of the fan vault and looked at it for a long moment. Then she looked up at the ceiling, then back at the drawing. "When did you say these were dated?" she asked. 1887, Eileen said. Lydia nodded slowly. She went to the laptop her student had set up on the cleared parlor table and opened the file she had brought from the university archive. A high-resolution scan of the 1872 Harlan-Vance County filing the official record of Halstead Estate, the document that had been cited in every architectural history of the building for 150 years. She placed Eleanor's structural section drawing beside the screen. "Look at the parlor ceiling in the 1872 filing," she said. Eileen looked. Conventional timber framing, the standard solution of the period, the structural notation minimal, the detail generic. "Now look at Eleanor's drawing. The fan vault, steel radial geometry, 12 load, points the mathematics of the structure annotated in Eleanor's precise technical hand." The 1872 drawing is a preliminary scheme, Lydia said. It is the kind of drawing you produce when you are establishing the general character of a project proportions, massing basic spatial organization. It is not a construction document. It does not contain the structural information needed to actually build anything. She looked at Eleanor's drawing. This is a construction document. This contains everything a contractor would need to fabricate and install the vault you are standing under. She moved through the comparisons methodically, the staircase, the skylight. Each time the pattern held the 1872 filing showed the simplest possible resolution of the design problem, the drawing of someone working quickly to produce a buildable scheme for a county permit. Eleanor's 1887 drawings showed fully developed solutions, the structural logic worked out completely, the technical information specific enough to build from. Lydia brought out the laser measurement tool. She spent 40 minutes in the parlor recording the precise geometry of the fan vault, the radius of each member, the angle of each junction, the position of each load point. One student entered the measurements as she called them out. When she finished, she brought the laptop to Eleanor's structural section drawing and compared the numbers. She worked through the comparison without speaking, point by point, measurement against drawing, the systematic attention of someone who was being careful because the conclusion mattered and needed to be exactly right. She straightened and looked at Eileen. The vault as built corresponds to Eleanor's drawing within the measurement tolerance of the instrument, she said, which is to say the correspondence is exact. They went to the basement. Frances and Eileen followed Lydia through the opening in the brick wall into Eleanor's studio. Lydia stood in the center of the room and turned slowly, taking in the drawings on the walls, the drafting table, the instruments on the table surface. Her students photographed and measured while she examined the detailed drawings up close, the molding profiles, the stair construction drawings, the fireplace surrounds with a magnifying glass. Her face close to the paper, looking at the line, quality, the ink consistency, the technical conventions of the notation. She sat down at Eleanor's drafting table. She picked up the compass from the table and turned it in her hands, set it back in its position. She looked at the journal on the table without opening it. Then she sat back in the chair and removed her glasses and pressed her fingers against her eyes for a moment, the particular pause of someone who has been focusing at high intensity and needs a breath before speaking. Frances was standing at the opening in the brick wall with her hand on the frame, watching. Lydia put her glasses back on. She said, "I have been studying Gilded Age architecture for 20 years. I have written 3 books on Midwest architects of the 19th century. I have examined original drawings in archives across 5 states." She looked around the room, at the drawings, at the table, at the instruments laid out on the drafting surface where Eleanor had left them in 1891. "I have never seen evidence this complete or this compelling." She looked at Eileen. Eleanor Vance designed Halstead Estate. The drawings are consistent with professional practice of the 1880s. The ink is consistent with architectural drafting materials of the period. The technical content demonstrates a level of structural understanding that was exceptional for any architect of that era. And the correspondence between Eleanor's drawings and the building as constructed is exact in every measurable detail. She paused. "We can prove this. Not in a legal sense, the principles are long dead and there is no proceeding to bring, but to any standard of historical scholarship. Eleanor Vance designed this building. Harlan Vance submitted a different set of drawings for the county permit and built from Eleanor's." She looked at Frances in the doorway. "I can write a paper for the Journal of the Society of Architectural Historians, peer-reviewed, permanently part of the scholarly record, and I have a colleague at the Columbus Dispatch who covers architecture and historic preservation. If this story goes to her, and I believe she would want it, Eleanor Vance's name will be in every architecture publication in the country within a month." She paused. "But this is your family. Eleanor was your great-great-aunt. The decision about how public this becomes belongs to you." Frances stood at the entrance to the studio with her hand on the brick frame of the opening that had been sealed for 135 years. She looked at the room where Eleanor had worked for 6 years, in the only space where she was permitted to be an architect. She looked at the drawings on the walls, at the table, at the compass Lydia had set back in its position. She did not answer immediately. Lydia has just confirmed it beyond any scholarly standard. Eleanor Vance designed Halstead Estate. The decision of what happens next belongs to Frances. If you believe Eleanor deserves to have her name restored after 135 years like this video. Frances made the decision on a Sunday morning. She called Eileen from the parking lot of a coffee shop in Dayton and said, "I want to publish. All of it. The drawings, the journal, the letters. I want people to know who Eleanor was." Eileen said she would call Lydia. The Columbus Dispatch article ran on October 15th. The headline was straightforward in the way of good journalism, the architect in the basement, how a sealed room revealed the woman who designed Halstead Estate. The reporter had spent 2 days at the estate with Lydia and Frances and Eileen, and she had understood the story quickly and had written it without embellishment because the story did not require embellishment. Eleanor Vance, Harlan Vance, the sealed studio. 14 drawings signed E. Vance Architect, 1887, the journal, the 31 letters, and Eileen Harwood, 72 years old, retired structural engineer who had bought a derelict estate at a county auction and found a wall that was not in the drawings. The article was the 3rd most read piece on the Dispatch website within 48 hours of publication. NPR called Lydia the following week. Architectural Digest ran a full feature the month after, with high-resolution photographs of Eleanor's drawings in the studio as it had been found. The American Institute of Architects added Eleanor Vance to its registry of architects whose contributions had been historically overlooked, a formal acknowledgement the kind that entered the permanent professional record. The Licking County Heritage Council convened an emergency session and voted unanimously. The heritage plaque at the front gate of Halstead Estate would be replaced. The old plaque read Halstead Estate, 1872, Harlan Vance Architect. The new plaque read Halstead Estate, 1887, designed by Eleanor Vance, built by Harlan Vance. Eileen did not pull the cloth from the new plaque. She had told Lydia the week before the ceremony without elaboration, "This is Frances's family." I opened the wall. Frances should be the one to say the name. Lydia had looked at her for a moment and then had nodded and had not pressed further because she had understood. On the morning of the ceremony, Eileen stood at the parlor window of Halstead Estate and watched the small crowd assemble at the front gate. County officials, local historians, a group of architecture students from OSU who had driven down after Lydia mentioned the ceremony in her graduate seminar, a reporter with a camera, Frances standing at the covered plaque with the cloth cord in her hand, her posture the contained uprightness of someone managing something that mattered. The cloth came away. The crowd applauded. The bronze lettering of the new plaque caught the October sun and held it. Eleanor Vance, her name on the gate of the building she had designed. In the same county where she had stood at the back of the dedication crowd in 1888 and smiled at a woman who said Harlan Vance was a genius and had said, "Yes, my father is very talented." Eileen stood at the parlor window under the fan vault and looked at the plaque from the inside of Eleanor's building and did not go out. She heard Frances come in. Frances crossed the parlor floor and stood beside her at the window. They looked out together at the gate, at the plaque, at the autumn light on the grounds of a property that had been waiting in one way or another for a very long time. Frances took Eileen's hand. Neither of them spoke. Two women, 72 and 64, standing under the steel vault that Eleanor had designed at 27 years old in the building that Eleanor had designed and never been permitted to claim on the October afternoon when the claiming finally happened. Outside, the new plaque was still catching the light. After the crowd dispersed and the students drove back to Columbus and the reporter filed her photographs and the county officials returned to their offices, Eileen walked the estate alone. She ended in the basement, through the opening in the brick wall into Eleanor's studio. The room had been prepared for its new purpose in the weeks since Lydia's visit. The drawings cleaned and documented a low glass barrier installed at the room's entrance to protect the space while allowing it to be seen, the drafting table visible behind the glass, the instruments on the table's surface, the drawings on the walls, the light from the ventilation passage in the corner, the thin strip of Ohio sky that Eleanor had been able to see from her underground studio for 6 years. On the wall beside the glass barrier, a small mounted panel. The text was Eileen's, written in the plain language she had used for structural reports for 38 years. Eleanor Vance, 1855 to 1942. She designed this house. She waited 135 years for someone to know. Eileen stood outside the glass and looked at the room for a long time. She thought about Eleanor at 27 sitting at this table with the compass and the ruler and the India ink working out the geometry of a vault that would stand for 135 years. Thinking in the language of loads and spans and structural logic, the same language Eileen had spent her professional life speaking. Working in a room below ground because it was the only room where she was permitted to be what she actually was. She thought about the last journal entry. I only want someone to know. She thought about the $47,000 she had paid at auction for a building that everyone else in the room had decided was not worth the trouble. She had been a structural engineer for 38 years. She had assessed hundreds of buildings. She had read thousands of drawings. She had spent her career making sure that what was built corresponded to what was designed and that the structures she certified would hold. She had never in 38 years repaired anything made of history. She turned off the studio light and went upstairs and stood on the front porch of Halstead Estate in the October dusk and looked at the new bronze plaque on the gatepost. Eleanor Vance, designed by Eleanor Vance. The building behind her was sound. The vault she had opened on a cold morning in October was the same vault it had always been. Nothing had changed in the stone and steel of the structure. Everything else had changed. Eleanor Vance designed Halstead Estate in 1887 when she was 27 years old. Her father signed his name to her drawings and accepted every compliment for 14 years until he died. On his deathbed, he said, "I am sorry for everything." Eleanor never publicly claimed what was hers. She lived 41 more years in silence and died in 1942 at the age of 87. But before she sealed that basement room, she left 14 drawings, a journal, and one sentence, "I only want someone to know." 135 years later, a 72-year-old woman bought the estate at a county auction. She saw mortar that did not match the foundation. She opened the wall, and Eleanor Vance finally had someone who knew. Her name is on the gate now. Her studio is a museum. And the vault she designed at 27 years old is still standing 135 years later without a crack. She did not need anyone to forgive her father for her. She only needed someone to open the wall. Another estate, another sealed room, another name that waited too long to be spoken correctly. It is in the playlist right here.